keeps walking around with his shoes untied. Keep walking around with your shoes untied. I caught you walking around with your shoes untied. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and out, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and in, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and out, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and in, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and out, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and in, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question. I'm over and out, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by. Just thinking about you, baby. When I'm passing by, I got my shoes untied, and I lost track of the wondering why. When I think about it, makes me think I'm right. Wonder about it and I don't know why. Won't you tell me, baby? I'm over and out, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and in, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie. Just thinking about you, baby. Sophisticated from my head to toe. Tell me something that you just don't know. Oh, I get warmer as I pass by. You look at me, baby, like my shoes untied, and it's starting to drive me crazy. I'm over and out, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and in, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie. Just thinking about you, baby. Walking around with your shoes untied. He keeps walking around with your shoes untied. Keep walking around with your shoes untied. I caught you walking around with your shoes untied. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and out, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and in, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and out, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and in, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and out, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and in, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question. I'm over and out, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by. Just thinking about you, baby. When I'm passing by, I got my shoes untied, and I lost track of the wondering why. When I think about it, makes me think I'm right. Wonder about it and I don't know why. Won't you tell me, baby? I'm over and up, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by, just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and in, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie, just thinking about you, baby. Sophisticated from my head to toe. Tell me something that you just don't know. Oh, I'll get warm as I pass by. You look at me, baby, like my shoes on tight, and it's starting to drive me crazy. I'm over it up, I got my shoes on tight, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by, just thinking about you, baby. I'm over it, I got my shoes on tight, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie, just thinking about you, baby. Walking around with your shoes untied. He keeps walking around with your shoes untied. Keep walking around with your shoes untied. I caught you walking around with your shoes untied, just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and up, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by, just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and in, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie, just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and up, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by, just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and in, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie, just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and up, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by, just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and in, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question. I'm over and up, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by, just thinking about you, baby. When I'm passing by, I got my shoes untied, and I lost track of the wondering why. When I think about it, makes me think I'm right. Wonder about it and I don't know why. Won't you tell me, baby? I'm over it up, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by, just thinking about you, baby. I'm over it, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie, just thinking about you, baby. Sophisticated from my head to toe. Tell me something that you just don't know. Oh, I get warm as I pass by. You look at me, baby, like my shoes untied, and it's starting to drive me crazy. I'm over it up, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by, just thinking about you, baby. I'm over it, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie, just thinking about you, baby. Walking around with your shoes untied. He keeps walking around with your shoes untied. Keep walking around with your shoes untied. I caught you walking around with your shoes untied, just thinking about you, baby. I'm over it up, question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and out, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stay by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and it, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and out, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stay by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and it, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question. I'm over and out, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stay by. Just thinking about you, baby. When I'm passing by, I got my shoes untied, and I lost track of the wondering why. When I think about it, makes me think I'm right. Wonder about it and I don't know why. Won't you tell me, baby? I'm over it up, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stay by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over it, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie. Just thinking about you, baby. Sophisticated from my head to toe. Tell me something that you just don't know. Oh, I get warmer as I pass by. You look at me, baby, like my shoes untied, and it's starting to drive me crazy. I'm over it up, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stay by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over it, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie. Just thinking about you, baby. Walking around with your shoes untied. He keeps walking around with your shoes untied. Keep walking around with your shoes untied. I caught you walking around with your shoes untied. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over it up, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stay by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over it, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over it up, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stay by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over it, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over it up, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stay by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over it, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question. I'm over it up, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stay by. Just thinking about you, baby. When I'm passing by, I got my shoes untied, and I lost track of the wondering why. When I think about it, makes me think I'm right. Wonder about it and I don't know why. Won't you tell me, baby? I'm over it up, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stay by. Just thinking about you, baby. I'm over it, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie. Just thinking about Sophisticated from head to toe. Tell me something that you just don't know. Oh, I get warm as I pass by. You look at me, baby, like my shoes on.
Welcome to the Bret, Easton, Ellis Podcast Book Club. We're live in Reykjavik, Iceland on a Tuesday night, Wednesday morning. As patrons of the podcast, we started this book club to dive back into Bret's work to greater appreciate his new audio memoir novel, The Shards, which he releases a new chapter of every 2 weeks on the Bret, Easton, Ellis Podcast. The Bret, Easton, Ellis Podcast was started in 2013 and has featured interviews with pop stars, writers, filmmakers, basically anyone with a story to tell or who Bret finds interesting. And if you want to be a part of The Shards and listening to this new audiobook, you can join and become a patron, and you'll also get access to all those interviews as well. On this live stream, we'll be discussing The Informers, a collection of short stories that Bret Easton Ellis published directly after his controversial novel, American Psycho. The Informers is 13 short stories. These are interconnected, shifting from points of view, time and place. It's more like a concept album portmanteau than a book. Bret Easton Ellis' aesthetic is on full display, the aesthetic of numbness. Numbness as a feeling, a kind of punk rock treatment of emotion. Joy, longing, excitement, dread, murder, mayhem are all flattened together in an effect that is both dark and, on occasion, very funny. We got a great live stream for you tonight. A special guest interview with the author of The Sound of Silence and Fight Club, Chuck Palahniuk. As well, we're going to be doing an in-depth discussion with the producer and reader of the live stream videos, Colton Martin. And live in the Secret Cellar studio, we're going to be talking to the Icelandic author, Bjorn Halldorsson. If you want to join in the discussion, just comment on either Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. Hi, and we're here in Reykjavik, Iceland at the Secret Cellar, Iceland's first and only stand-up comedy club, but we're not open because of lockdown and all that sort of stuff. A few little housekeeping things before we get the live stream really going. I want to apologize for everyone who was expecting it an hour earlier. There's no daylight savings time in Iceland, and I'm actually from Saskatchewan in Canada, where there's also no daylight saving time, so I had no idea, so it's a little bit of a mistake, but the event time on Facebook is still correct. I want to give a special thanks just before we start to Lucky Records, who let us film the intro there. We've been having a little bit of issues because we've been having about 40,000 earthquakes in the last 2 weeks here in Iceland, and we're about to have a volcanic eruption possibly. So even tonight while you're watching, if everything starts to shake, you know what's happening. How this live stream is going to work is we're going to have interviews, like I said in the intro, with Coldon Martin, Chuck Palahniuk, and Bjorn Halldorsson. But I really want you guys to get involved and to comment and to kind of join the discussion. So when we start, we're going to have the interviews with Coldon, and then we're going to have Chuck Palahniuk. We're going to have some readings as well, which Coldon does all the animations for, and his girlfriend Brandy is also reading one of the readings tonight. And then we're going to dive right in live with Bjorn Halldorsson, and we're going to talk about The Informers, and we're going to try and get comments from you and get a discussion going. And we'll go kind of story by story, and you guys can say how you felt about it, what you think, what your favorite one was, what you reacted to. This is a really big chance because after American Psycho, which was our last live stream and was Bret's third book, The Informers is a really interesting book to get into because it has a little bit on display of the American Psycho, but also the Less Than Zero, the kind of Joan Didion journalistic descriptions from afar of each character shifting from point of view. And so there's a lot to talk here and a lot to unpack. And so we hope you really kind of join in and add to the discussion. So just don't be afraid to comment on either Facebook, YouTube, or on Twitter, and we'll get those comments answered here on the live stream. So right now we're going to go into a video reading, a first reading from the book, just to get you in the mood. To let some of you who haven't reread the book recently, to kind of remind you of the prose a little bit, by Coldon Martin. And then we're going to go right into an interview that I did with Coldon Martin. This happens to be his favorite book of Bret's. It was the first book he read. And that makes this kind of special because Coldon and I have been working together to make these live streams possible. So it's really nice to be able to talk to him. And then after that, we'll be doing the interview with Chuck Palahniuk. And this is Chuck Palahniuk's favorite work of Bret's and one of his favorite books, period, as you might have seen. He tweeted this out, so we hope if you're joining because of what Chuck Palahniuk said, his interview is just after that. And then we'll go live, and please keep commenting, keep joining the discussion, and we're going to keep this going. So we're going to have a good night. At any point, if it does go out or anything shakes or anything like that because of earthquakes or anything like that, we'll get it back up as quickly as possible. If we do need to restart the stream, you guys know just to go back to the Facebook page, the Twitter, or the YouTube. But without further ado, I guess we can go right into the first reading by Coldon Martin and then his interview.
Things I remember about Jamie. Getting high with him at an Oingo Boingo concert in 11th grade. Drunk on the beach in Malibu at a party at an Iranian classmate's house. A lame trick he played on some frat guys from USC at a party in Palm Springs, which actually injured Tad Williams pretty badly. I don't remember the joke, but I remember Raymond, Jamie, and myself stumbling down one of the corridors of the Hilton Riviera, all three of us stoned. Christmas decorations, someone losing an eyeball, a fire truck arriving too late, a sign above a door that said, "Do not enter." Doing okay coke on a yacht with him on prom night, and him telling me that I was easily his best friend. Doing another line off a black enamel table, I had asked about Dirk, about Graham, Raymond, a couple of movie stars. Jamie said he liked Dirk and Graham, and he didn't like Raymond a whole lot. "Dude is bogus," were his exact words. Another line, he said that he understood me or something like that, and I did another line and believed him because it's easier to move through the motions than not to. One late night in August on the way to Palm Springs, Jamie tried to light a joint and either lost control of the car because he was speeding or had a blowout, and the BMW flew off the freeway and he was killed instantly. Dirk had been following him. They were going to spend the weekend before Labor Day at Jeffrey's parents' place in Rancho Mirage, and they left a party we had all been to at Studio City, and it was Dirk who had pulled Jamie's crushed, bloody body from the car, and would wave down some guy who was on his way to Las Vegas to build a tennis court. And the guy drove to the nearest hospital, and an ambulance arrived 70 minutes later, and Dirk had sat there in the desert, staring at the dead body. Dirk never spoke about it a lot, just little details he gave us the week after it happened. The way the BMW tumbled, rolled across sand, a smashed cactus, how the upper part of Jamie's body burst through the windshield, the way Dirk pulled him out, laid him down, looked through Jamie's pockets for another joint. I've been tempted a lot of times to go out to where it happened and check it out, but I don't go out to Palm Springs anymore, because whenever I'm there, I feel very wasted and it's a drag.
Hi, I'm here with one of the producers and the person who makes all the animations and videos alongside the readings with Bret, Easton, Ellis podcast book club, Coldon Martin in Virginia. How are you doing?
Very good, man. Very good. Nice to see you.
Yeah, it's nice to see you. So you've been obviously following along because you helped produce the live stream with the book club. How has it been reading along, getting back into the material, and of course making the reading videos?
It's been really great. You know, I've been a fan of Bret's work since I was 14 years old. And I kind of just started devouring the catalog as soon as I read The Informers. The Informers was actually the first book I read of his. And it's been really, really cool revisiting him in this new context because, you know, one thing that I think that the podcast, you know, sort of opened up for me was just the international reach
of Bret's work. And so to be a part of the podcast and just be part of this huge community and network of people literally all over the world has been really kind of my favorite part about it, in addition to revisiting the work, especially now in a different place in my life.
Yeah, and so when you're going, like, because these videos that with the readings, it's my favorite part of the live stream. Because I'm a big, like, the reason I'm doing the live stream is because I love the writing. And then to hear it kind of come alive with, like, the first one you did, we used, the speaker was Icelandic from Once Upon a Time in the Valley podcast. And she was the speaker. But since then, just because you are already making the videos, you've been doing the readings along with your girlfriend as well.
Yeah. And, that was a little intimidating at first, just because this work really means a lot to me. And the idea of putting visuals to it, I kind of feel a responsibility, for lack of a better word, to not mess it up. Because honestly, it's kind of funny how I got into Bret's work in the first place. And I was 14 years old. And my high school girlfriend, we were hanging out, and she handed me this copy of The Informers, this very copy, and said, "Hey, I thought this cover looked really cool. It seems like something that you would be into." And I was like, I actually am. There was something about the picture, a sterility to it. The Ace lounge chairs, which are basically just as common in Bret's works as Wayfarers. Seeing this California setting, but so muted and cold, just this absence of humanity. Immediately, I was sucked into the vibe of the cover. And so the visual was what brought me in the first place. And then as soon as I started reading the book, I just kind of got intoxicated by just how much the imagery spoke to me. I remember reading Sitting Still, the chapter with a student returning home on the train, and just making it in my mind feel almost like this art house movie where we're getting flashes, we're getting these vignettes, we're getting these moments, these impressions of these scenes, but without the burden of like a linear narrative or all these plot machinations. And so to me, Bret's work has always been this sort of montage to me. We come and drift in and out of scenes and characters. And so I've always thought of his work that way. And so finally having the chance to put visuals to it, I've really, really wanted to maintain that feeling that's always been in my mind. And then also knowing that mood, tone, style, and atmosphere are pretty big tenets around these parts, I really felt like I wanted to make them as atmospheric as I could. I didn't want them to be this linear depiction of what's happening, but rather this impression. Bret's work is all about these small details adding up to this bigger sum. And I wanted the videos to do that.
With The Informers, this is a short story collection. It comes out after American Psycho, which is like a bigger task to read, and probably like a kind of an epic thing to write as well. But this is just as complex, and I found the reading The Informers is a really enjoyable experience because it's an interconnected short story collection, but also still just short stories if they stand on their own.
To me, it's almost like, despite the shorter format, despite the fact that we're getting from an author that already likes to keep things pretty concise, we're getting these super, super brief perspectives into this world. But to me, it almost like maximizes his style. And especially coming from American Psycho, where, all of the asides and this just intricate kind of mental web of this person is on display. This kind of returns, I think, to that documentary style aesthetic. We're shown a situation with very little judgment, and we just kind of drift in and out. I think that the short story format just works for Bret's style so well. What do you think?
All of the pressure is off for some reason, because if you just read American Psycho or thought of him as the author of American Psycho, to read The Informers is this kind of like, it's just kind of wonderful break. Like everything feels so good when you're reading it. I read story by story, and you're piecing it together because they are interconnected, and you have to figure out what time everyone is at.
where it is on the, where it is chronologically, which character you're actually in the mind of. And I just found it really enjoyable. This is this is one of my favorite reading experiences, I think. But I agree with you. Sitting Still is my favorite section, and I can't really explain why. I think it's my silly hopefulness part. This dread you have of being on a train, that the tracks are set and you can't get off, but then at the end being able to just get on another train is I just like the feeling of it.
And there's something about that story too of, you know, when you're in the train looking out the window, things are just flashing by. They're moving by in sort of this blur. And, you know, there's a couple passages in there, the narrator just seeing America, but within the distance of it just speeding by. And that's something that's just always spoke to me, and especially about some of that language of just passing through the desert or passing by trailer parks and dilapidated neighborhoods. And I agree that Bret's influences, you know, they're always on display in everything that he does. And he's very, very direct in saying, you know, who he's kind of standing on the shoulders on. The Joan Didion piece, I think, especially in Sitting Still, but also through the rest of the collection, is really on display. And Joan, at one point, like when talking about her writing style, said, "I was meant to know the plot, but all I knew was what I saw. Flash pictures in variable sequence, images with no meaning behind their temporary arrangement. Not a movie, but a cutting room experience." And, you know, and of course you can say that so succinctly in like 2 sentences, but like that to me is just a central part of The Informers and a central part of any good short story, where you're kind of dropped in, and instead of having all of this explanation and exposition, you're instead confronted with the situation, and you're going to be leaving, you know, very shortly after. And can't help but think of Raymond Carver, of course, when you think about, you know, kind of the contemporary short story master, and you think about, you know, also who was kind of a contemporary at that time, just in terms of what people were talking about, and this expansion of minimalism or blank fiction or any of those kind of catch-all terms. And one thing that I thought was really interesting was that Carver's stories are about these working class people and about these kind of moments of real sort of crisis. But The Informers is almost the inversion of that. The succinct nature of the stories is there. The fact that you're plopped into a situation with little explanation or context is there. But instead of it being these people that can't reckon with kind of the sadness of their situation, The Informers is just all of these people that probably could have more self-awareness than they actually do.
I feel close to the work because of my response to the writing and like to the tone and everything, like we're talking about. There's this aesthetic response where I have nothing in common really with any of the characters, other than I feel a connection to this aesthetic.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. And like I said, mood, style, tone, atmosphere, this is central to the Bret Easton Ellis experience. Like it is the axis by which his work turns, you know, and he says the same thing basically every time he talks about it.
Yeah.
And it is definitely not the type of warm fiction that is designed to pull on your emotional strings, get you to relate. But I was reading about Hemingway, which obviously, you know, you basically have to reckon with as any sort of short fiction writer at some point. And he was talking about this notion of the iceberg theory. Have you ever heard of this?
Yeah, I have.
Pretty simple idea, right? It's the idea that events and ideas or really overt thematic explanation can be completely left out of a story, with the implication really being the foundation by which it rests. I think Secrets of Summer is probably the most iconic story from this collection. And as we were doing some of the discussions on the group or, you know, from the Patreon, everybody remembers this. And I remember reading it for the first time. Look, I hadn't read American Psycho. I hadn't read Less Than Zero. I didn't know who this author was. I'm reading all of these stories that are really kind of not down to earth and that they're warm and homespun, but they're grounded in very real situations. When I read Secrets of Summer for the first time, I was like, what is happening? Because it was, again, I didn't know about the sort of Patrick Bateman formula or construct about, kind of this notion of the reality that you believe versus, what is actually happening. And so I had to read that story twice, like when I was 14, because I was like, wait a minute, is this guy actually a vampire? And then you get to the therapist section where he is just like boasting and bragging, and the therapist like doesn't care at all. It was kind of like my first taste of kind of the American Psycho, kind of conceit of what is real, what does this violence mean, and what does it mean that it is delivered in this just cold, casual way? I mean, that chapter is pretty funny too.
Yeah. And I think because I've talked to Todd about this as well, because he had heard Bret being called a moralist, and people nowadays, I think, just by the way that's used in the press and things like that, morality and stuff like that, people don't understand why you would call this a moralist writing. And it's because exactly what you said. I am not going to give you the fantasy of being a hero. Like if you always make it so the characters do this wonderful, heroic, savior, great ending, the person there doesn't take responsibility for the stuff that they're seeing or how they would really react. Whereas this kind of mature, numb coldness that's in Bret's work, you think about it a lot longer. Like if you just read this story about a child being kidnapped and then one of them goes, no, this is wrong, and stops his friends and runs out and like, we can't do this anymore, you would never think about it again, because you'd be like, yep, that's a story. But as soon as you don't get that relief and you're confronted with the fact that everything that happened in this story, the fact that you can't act while you're reading it is just like you would do if you were really there. I think that's the moment that it becomes literature, and it isn't just, it isn't just fantasy.
And that's why I think this sort of documentary quality is often attributed to his work. And like Joan Didion, there's not this effort to try to imbue everything with some sort of meaning. Instead, there's this effort to allow these smaller observational details to suggest a time, a setting, a person, a moment, but not have that burden, like you mentioned, this sort of responsibility to try to shape a narrative that says something. Yeah. Sometimes what is not said and what is sort of implied, it goes back to that iceberg theory. I think another really popular chapter from this, another really popular story, I think it was even published independently, is Discovering Japan.
Right. Yeah, I think even in the group, a lot of people were saying that that's one of their favorite sections.
What do you think stands out? Like, why do you think that one really kind of touches on it? Like, what gets people going on that one?
Well, because it is like, it has so many elements, especially for the time it was published as well. Like, this is an American abroad story, which is, has all these elements to it now. The idea of the American empire and hegemony of American culture spreading throughout even to the farthest reaches, like Japan, which would be culturally the most different. And there is this kind of that feeling. And then there's the rock star feeling and the artist versus the depravity, what you need to be creative. There's all these elements to it that I think people find attractive, and it also, it also subverts any of your kind of your notions of these things while playing on a kind of a hierarchy that you understand, that you feel that you understand, that kind of that you're there for. I think that's a lot of it. But
yeah, no, I love what you said. And I think Discovering Japan is notable for a couple of reasons. One, stylistically, it captures that jet lag feeling. You're going into this completely new culture. There's this massive time difference. It's so much more extreme in Discovering Japan because it's this drug-induced sex and blood and everything. But one thing that I think is interesting about that story is, like, look, in Less Than Zero, Clay has a proximity to famous producers or the children of top Hollywood screenwriters or filmmakers, and that's always there. The kind of Hollywood setting and vibe and atmosphere. Discovering Japan really starts reckoning with the notion of celebrity. And I think that is a metatextual quality that begins here and is an undercurrent through the rest of the catalog. Is this idea of being a public persona. And you sort of mentioned that of like, what does it take to be an artist? Is it the people that are constantly telling you who you are? That is plants the seed of a theme that we're going to see again and again and again, where it's not just the proximity to famous people, but actually famous people. And I think that is sort of the starting point of that. And it's really, it wasn't until I reread it this time, having read Lunar Park, having read Imperial Bedrooms, now hearing The Shards, of how much Bret seems to almost be constantly in conversation with himself about the notion of fame, the notion of celebrity, and what that sort of implies about dehumanizing somebody.
Yeah, that's really good. That's all the time I have right now, but thank you very much. And I know everyone's going to enjoy your readings, things like that, and hopefully we'll get you back on the next live streams to discuss them as we go along. This is really great. Thanks for talking to us.
That was Colton Martin. A great interview. And what we're going to do now, like I said, how this is going is we're going to have Coldon Martin, and then we have Chuck Palahniuk coming up next. And then after that, when Bjorn joins me live, we're going to be able to have a discussion. So please keep commenting, keep joining the discussion, and we're going to pop all those questions up. We've even asked a few questions beforehand that we're going to answer. So we're going to have one more interview that we've pre-recorded, and then we're going to go into the live section where you guys can join the conversation. But this is, of course, our special guest, the highlight of the live stream, and we're very lucky to have Chuck Palahniuk.
Hey, York, I'm here. I've got my copy.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, we're here. This is the fourth live stream, and we're doing The Informers, which is an interesting change of pace when you consider American Psycho came before this, and to go into this, to be publishing a series of short stories that are interconnected. How did you get introduced to The Informers, or when did you first find it yourself?
Bret Ellis was coming through Portland on tour, and I was going to go to his event. And I'd been told by people who worked at that particular bookstore that they had to have all this extra security because American Psycho had been such a, provocative thing. And so I went, and the book was The Informers. So it was the first time I got to see Bret read in person. At that point, I was unpublished. So I was just a face in the crowd, and nobody threw any pies.
Okay. And had you read The Informers? Had you read American Psycho? What was your first introduction to Bret?
I had read Rules of Attraction, and I had read The Informers, I think, going into it, but that's all I had read.
Okay. And The Informers is kind of interesting. I'm not sure about the construction of it. I haven't really been able to ask. I'm interviewing Bret at the end of this, after we do all the books, and then I'm going to kind of do an interview over all the work. But I've heard from the group and discussions that he kind of made it interwoven afterwards. He was gathering work, but it seems so well kind of placed as a short story collection that it's interesting to see how he does it.
It reminds me structurally of Tama Janowitz's Slaves of New York, where it's almost a novel because the characters all sort of interconnect in some way. And we're following, in Slaves of New York, we're following Eleanor through this very specific subculture. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Slaves of New York was an influence.
Yeah. I haven't read that. And also you told me a little about that you think you can see similarities to Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son.
Very much so. Jesus's Son by Dennis Johnson follows a character who's known to the reader only as Fuckhead. And this is a character who's kind of in that phase of life where he is between his parents and a family of his own. So it's kind of a character in that kind of limnoid state where all your closest friends are your peers, and none of them are really any smarter than you. So you're all making all of these mistakes together in this kind of pointless drifting existence. So there's a kind of flattening of drama where horrible things happen and happy things happen, but there's very little reaction to them, either horrible things or happy things. So there's this very flattened emotional affect in both books, and things are kind of taken at face value. So yeah, Jesus's Son has a lot of kind of inadvertent humor, because as terrible things happen, people are so drugged out of their minds that they don't react to them appropriately. They just kind of nod and, sort of move on with their lives. And it's that failure to engage with drama that creates comedy in the Dennis Johnson book. And I noticed that quite a bit, or at least my reading of it, in The Informers.
Yeah, I noticed that quite a bit as well too. Even actually in the previous stuff, American Psycho and Rules of Attraction, a lot of the humor is this kind of flattened, because there's no response to these things, that you almost have to laugh for them or burst out just to have some release of tension.
And also when something horrible happens and people react to an inappropriate aspect of it, such as when in The Informers, the park ranger finds the burned up body of the man that he's taking up to the crash site. He says, it looked like a tiny Darth Vader. It trivializes the horror by comparing it to this popular culture image. And it's those moments where the horror is not unpacked and not recognized that makes it occur as comedy.
Yeah, this flattening affect. When we were emailing back and forth, you mentioned that there's a similarity even to the music that was coming out in the 1980s, the new wave music that has this kind of affect as well.
Right. I'm thinking right off the bat, punk music would do these covers on very emotional ballads, but the covers would be so flattened, and it would be hard to call it singing, but like the Flying Lizards did that cover on Money. And when the Supremes did Money, it was a great dancing song. But when the Flying Lizards did it, it was basically someone staring into the camera and saying words. So in a way, the music was trying to be as artless as possible and still, still put its message across. And that's kind of the simplicity I see in The Informers, is that it's the kind of fiction that you read and you accept as reality, because you yourself could be writing it, or any of your friends could be writing it.
Yeah, there is, that's the one thing I've found kind of great rereading it, is that it feels like I want, yeah, exactly, like I want to have written something like this, or this is how I because it has this naturalistic, minimalistic kind of feel to it, that you feel like you're thinking those thoughts as you're reading it, which of course is the kind of the goal. I'm listening. I think I told you in the email, I'm listening to your book on writing, Consider This, because I couldn't get a copy of it here in Iceland, but I got it as an audio book, and I've been listening to it because I have to walk, and it's really, we're having a winter storm and everything here right now, so it's the only thing I can focus on. And so reading The Informers again while listening to your book, I'm kind of dissecting it in ways I never noticed before, like in the one with Les and Tim when they go to Hawaii together. Mm-hmm. having the Rachel, the girl that Tim's interested in, and then the dad kind of tries to take over, having her all of a sudden give that lecture on manta rays, it gives this, all of a sudden you're like, oh, she knows what she's doing. It gives so much depth to these characters that I think I felt before, but until I started kind of dissecting it in the way that I've been following in your book, I'm seeing all these techniques are coming out in almost every story. This is a really kind of fascinating work of short stories.
And also in that story that you cite called "In the Islands,"
Yeah.
that is the chapter title from a Joan Didion book, The White Album, "In the Islands."
Yeah.
And so there is that strange parallel between LA sort of ennui and then escaping to Hawaiian ennui, which is almost even worse. And it's just one of many parallels between The Informers and Didion's book, The White Album.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and you have, what are some of the other parallels that you've noticed?
Boy, it's more to do with style. A kind of tone of an absurd tone, but an absurd tone that's kind of taken in resignation. That nobody ever really actively tries to change anything. You don't really have a protagonist who has a goal in mind and is coming up against obstacles. You don't have that kind of plotting.
Yeah.
And in Joan Didion, things always seem to be in this kind of ongoing stasis where Joan Didion is just simply the witness to things constantly decaying and falling apart, and people just being in this complete disconnect from one another, and no one being able to communicate anything effectively. So that's, beyond some, parallels in setting and in the cultures that are being illustrated.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I really see is this constant sort of documentation of dysfunction.
Yeah, that's I guess he recently had a guest on his podcast, Gregory Dunn, who's related to Joan Didion. And I watched the documentary with Joan Didion, and one of the things that kind of I just instantly saw what kind of Bret got from reading her and everything, other than the writing, was when they asked her about when she was in Hyde Park and they saw like these hippie parents give LSD to a small child, and she said, this is gold. Like she wanted this idea of not reacting and having this distance when you're reporting. It makes everything kind of absurd, but it is an addictive tone and style that you can see in Bret's work as well.
And tone-wise, his voice is so much like hers. Doug Copeland, the author of Generation X, once told me, and this is Doug's take on it. He said, if it wasn't for Joan Didion, Bret Ellis would not have a voice. And so whenever I read one or the other, I do hear them both. But I find that's a case with a lot of writers who admire each other. And that Joan Didion was one of the public figures, maybe the only one, that stood up for Bret when American Psycho was such a huge controversy. Joan Didion wrote essays and she made public proclamations that the book should be accepted and the book should be read.
Yeah, she even dedicated a book to him as well.
Okay.
Yeah. And you can see that. And I think when I did the live stream of it, you notice that she is interested in this kind of writing as well, because Norman Mailer's novel American Dream, she also kind of stood behind that one when it got quite a backlash as well, especially from people at the time of it being misogynist, because it kind of was on purpose in that way. Yeah. Another thing I wanted to talk about that I found really interesting was when you get from the story Sitting Still, which is Susan, that's Graham's sister, and she's coming home from Camden. I just, there's something about the way she describes Cheryl, which is her husband's new girlfriend who he's engaged to and getting married to, and then jumping into the next story, and it's a jump forward in time where okay, what's the story called? Sorry, Water from the Sun. I knew that. So it jumps forward, and you don't really, because the nice thing about these stories as well is that you have to piece together when they are and who's narrating and all that. So you're constantly looking for clues as you're following along. So it's always got this excitement to each story because you're like, where am I now and who is this? And when you get to this water from the sun, the idea I had of Cheryl as this kind of like flash dance, aspiring news anchor, 20-something that her father's marrying in a midlife crisis, and then you get her in her own sort of crisis just in the next chapter. I found that to be one of my favorite sections in the book, even though it's definitely not one of the most kind of provocative or anything like that. I found it to be so memorable, or something I wanted to kind of look over again and again.
Was that the chapter in which Cheryl's at Cantor's Deli?
Yeah, that's right.
I thought it was like page 79 for some reason.
Yeah, it's like in my edition, I have the UK editions because I'm in,
Okay.
but it's page 94.
94. That is that scene in the deli just left me so shaken, where people come up to her and recognize her, and she's so vulnerable, and then they completely humiliate her by asking for her autograph, this thing that should be a kind of honor, this way of sort of recognizing and acclaiming her.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
use it as a way to really hurt her. And there's a real sense of menace. You don't know if they're going to let her leave. There's a sense of being so trapped. I just thought that scene I'd never seen anything like that. It was as frightening as anything I've seen in Joyce Carol Oates or in Dennis Johnson. Just such a frightening scene.
Yeah, and then just the effects. Yeah.
It's page 97 in the US edition.
Okay, 97. Yeah. So just
97.
Yeah, and just after that, after she has this encounter at Cantor's, when she goes off to I think, is it before or after the airport bar? Because I just remember her walking around the airport bar, and then she's doing coke in the bathroom, and she's hoping someone starts following her. And
It's right after the airport bar.
Yeah. So she's looking for this. There's this weird kind of, I want to be followed, and I'm upset. And then she ends up in Cantor's, and she's humiliated and kind of terrified, but she's also kind of looking for trouble in a way, even though it doesn't, you can relate to her in that sense.
And as another example of a horrible possibility that's not really realized. So you don't have that kind of plotting where something terrible is going to happen. It has to be either averted, or the terrible thing does happen and we have to somehow recover from it.
Right.
There's always that sort of menace that never comes to fruition.
Yeah, and that's yeah, I don't know. That's one of my favorite sections in the book. It's incredible. One of the things I guess I wanted to kind of shift over a little bit to is like, as a writer, yourself, a very famous one and successful one, you've written in both forms. Is there a major difference that you find when you're trying to do something like a short story or a collection of short stories compared to something like a novel? In Bret's podcast, when he had Nick Pizzolatto on and they were talking about Tom Cruise for 2 episodes, one of the interesting comments I picked up on was this idea that short stories can almost be perfect, that there are perfect short stories, whereas the novel never has that sort of kind of aesthetic to it. You can never really expect it. It's not supposed to, we're not expecting that from it. It's too large and it's too complex. What do you think about the two differences between the two?
I totally agree. And I think that with a short story, you can experiment with a tone and a kind of warping of the language that is so specific to the story. You're more or less creating a language just for that story. And you're teaching the reader how to read this language so that they have this kind of joy of reading for the first time that they haven't had since the first or second grade, that you can totally immerse the reader in the language as well as the story. And you're not writing in this sort of received third person Charles Dickens language. You're writing in a really broken, customized language that you could not carry off over an entire book. One of my favorite writers, a short story writer named Mark Richard, that Bret probably knows because Mark Richard went off to Los Angeles and he wrote for years for Party of Five. I think he was the the chief writer on Party of Five for its entire existence.
Okay.
But Mark Richard had written a short story called Fish Boy that was all full of F's and V's and S's. So it had this constant sibilant lisping sound to it. And that was great in a short story. But then he announced he was going to do a 300-page novel of Fish Boy. And when he wrote a 300-page novel of S's and V's and F's, it overwhelmed people. And this novel that people thought was going to be a total landmark became kind of a total disaster.
Yeah.
So the short story can take those liberties with language that exhaust a reader over the course of a whole novel. But another thing to keep in mind is that you can remember what the drive is like from here to the store, but you cannot remember the entire linear drive from here to Kansas City. You can only remember certain high points, certain events on that drive. The human mind can only accommodate so much linear memory that if you were to write a novel as cleanly as a short story, that you could remember every plot point, you could remember the entire thing like it was an episode of The Night Gallery, then that would not be a very good novel. And I find that the novels that we do like are the novels or the movies where we remember only a few very strong things, and that the movies and the novels we love, we don't love 70% of them, but we love the parts that we love enough that we think we love the entire thing. So in a way, the novel has to have these digressions, these little detours that take us away from this, ongoing plot. Because since we can't remember the entire plot of a novel, we need to remember specific scenes. And that's how we come to love the novel, or usually the movie. So I think that it behooves a novel not to be perfect, because we can't remember the whole of the perfection. And we're more likely to like it if it's imperfect, because that way we can remember just the specific, really strong aspects of it. People watch Fight Club, they remember the terminal illness support groups, they remember the Raymond K. Hessel gun to the convenience store head guy. Yeah. Maybe they remember a couple other things, but they remember those things so much that they think they remember the entire thing, and they think they love the entire thing. So I think it benefits the novel when it's flawed in that inconsistent way.
Yeah.
Just my take.
No, I think I think you're right. There's something about while you're reading, because reading a novel is different than the movie. As you're reading a novel, you're also forgetting it as you're reading it. Yeah. And the novel allows this space for you to have this like relationship with the text. So it's this imaginative kind of back and forth as you read. Whereas because I have two stepsons, and one of the big problems with getting anyone to read nowadays, but even to watch movies, it's become difficult if the movies are not edited the same way Pixar movies are edited, which is really short, snappy, linear, one, and because they don't want to have this imaginative kind of spaces in between. If it's got too much delay between action or sounds or lights, they give up. They're not as interested in narrative storytelling, which is kind of it's crazy to me.
And I think so often the scenes that people remember from my novels are the scenes that I wrote originally as short stories, and they have a setup and they have a payoff, and the whole scene happens in a very small number of pages. And people don't have to keep a lot of incompletes in their head. They get the reward just from that one scene. And so Citizen Kane, I hate 70% of Citizen Kane, but I love when the curtain goes up on Susan Alexander and she sings so badly and she's so publicly humiliated and no one claps at the end. Those scenes are so strong and so heartbreaking that I think I love the entire movie until I start to watch the movie, and I find myself fast forwarding through so much of it. So Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but then like this relationship of reading, I guess, to the short story and to the novel, that it is different. I find when I was like when I was reading American Psycho, I was rereading it and I had a completely different reaction than when I read it 10 years ago. But I had this thing in my mind where I knew for some reason I thought it was going to be difficult. Like I was going to be slogging through it and there was going to be long things where it's a bunch of listing of labels that I was going to find difficult, but I wasn't going to skip any words or anything because it's, have to be serious. But I didn't find that. Whereas when you're reading like a short story collection, I never have this fear of having like, you never get this anxiety about reading or finishing the book. There's kind of like these chunks as they go together. So it's a different experience, just even the reading of this collection of short stories. I feel like I can read it constantly, whereas a novel, I always feel like I'm kind of, okay, I'm kind of dipping back into it. And I want to make sure I have time and I'm not going to be interrupted, where I take informers with me and I can start reading it anywhere I want in between anything I'm doing.
I would at this point really recommend Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son, but also there's a Korean American author named Naimi Moon, and she has a collection called Miles from Nowhere that is at least as bleak as anything that Bret has written. Miles from Nowhere by Naimi Moon, and it's Namimun. So those are both fantastic short story collections, very much in the same tone as The Informers.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's something to check out as well. I'll add it to the comments too for the live stream. Another thing that we kind of talked about a little bit, and this is a little bit controversial, but we can kind of go over it, is the David Foster Wallace's collection, A Girl with Curious Hair. The short story that has the title of the book, A Girl with Curious Hair, has kind of it appears to be kind of satirizing the way that that Bret Easton Ellis writes, his tone and his style. Is this character Sick Puppy, this Republican character who's obsessed with how he looks.
And the way it was explained to me a long time ago by people in publishing was that this story by David Foster Wallace, which is arguably the best known story by David Foster Wallace, was supposed to have been a parody, a kind of sending up of Bret Ellis. And it was supposed to be his tone, his kind of, seeming exploit, abuse of female characters, abuse of animals, racism, casual racism. But the difference is that I think Foster Wallace kind of nailed the stylistic aspects of it without getting us to any kind of an emotional epiphany, any kind of an emotional effect. You read Foster Wallace and you think this guy is very good at mimicking superficial things and extremely bright. And that's always so impressive, that real cleverness. But a friend of mine once said that reading Foster Wallace, he has never laughed out loud and he has never cried. He's never, been touched emotionally in any way. He's just always been impressed by the cleverness. And I think that writers like Joan Didion and Bret Ellis can write in that detached, flattened effect way, but they can still achieve emotional engagement and emotional effects. So, I don't think that that Foster Wallace really did a very effective satire on Bret Ellis.
Yeah, I know. I agree. Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. I remember, when I sat down like every young person does who's interested in literature around my age and tried to read. I didn't finish it. Infinite Jest. I remember people telling me how funny he was, and then never laughing out loud the entire 300 and however many pages that I got into it. But when I read Bret Easton Ellis or yourself, these are things where I'm laughing out loud and buying copies for my friends because I want them to experience this like being on a bus and laughing out loud and feeling like a crazy person because you're having this secret joy in your head while you're reading alone. You don't, there is a cleverness to David Foster Wallace that never really resonates emotionally.
when you read the Namie Moon book, it's even worse, because at her most tragic moments, you'll find yourself laughing. And she sets you up to have this hysterical laugh at this moment when everything is just heartbreaking.
Okay, yeah. I'm in. Like the last time I think I was crazy laughing was I read Portnoy's Complaint for the first time, and I had all these ideas about it and criticisms about it, which is funny. Growing up in my age, I'm 34, and yourself, Bret Easton Ellis. There's a few other David Foster Wallace. There's a few other writers where, for some reason, before I ever read you or was about I had this idea, and you kind of had to choose a side before you picked up the book. There was this feeling like, oh no, you have to this is not good. Like I remember before I read American Psycho that I had planned to not like it before I started reading it, because kind of in university and the people I was around and what I'd been told. And then Fight Club was the same thing. But I read it before, luckily, early enough that I wasn't influenced too much. So I got to just enjoy it as is. But there was always this back and forth. And what do you think about that with transgressive fiction that makes it so, especially now when everyone is everything is put on the equal footing? Something I found really interesting about, again, your book, Consider This, is when you say things that you would do in the novel are not things you would want to do in a movie or in a comic book because of the access of people to it and the immediacy of it. You can be a lot more just intense and crazy and lunatic, just a maniac in a novel, because it's so much work to do it, to read it and to consume it. Whereas if you just made an image of awful, horrible things happening, there's it's not the same effect.
Well, and also with the novel, you have to be educated or of a certain age that you understand what's happening. You understand the euphemisms so that you know what's being depicted. And also with a novel, the cost of production is so low that it doesn't have to reach an enormous audience to be a success. Where with a movie, cost of production is enormous. So it has to reach this gigantic common denominator to ever make a profit. So if you're going to write novels, I think that the whole point is to write the stories that only novels can tell at that point, or short stories. And if you're going to write movies or television, then you should be writing movies or television, that you should take advantage of the strengths that one has and the other does not.
Yeah, and I guess another thing with transgressive fiction that I interviewed Irvin Welsh for American Psycho, and he talks about this quite a bit. He has a TV program called Offended, where he's talking about transgressive fiction. An interesting thing in your case is that you're kind of you came from a working class background. Before you were a published author, you were working in this manufacturing factory. You had a journalism degree. It's a little obviously you're educated, but it's a different background than someone like Bret's writing, where you have it from this privileged kind of point of view. Do you think that makes a difference in how people engage with transgressive material?
Wow. I would say the largest factor is the fact that I do have the journalism degree. So it's kind of my impulse to always go out and to listen for the most compelling stories that people tell, and then to repeat those stories to different people and see if they evoke even further stories along those same themes. So what I'm doing is a kind of Studs Terkel field study of a theme and trying to get that theme illustrated as many ways as possible from real people through real life events. And I think it might make it a little harder to criticize, because it is not just coming from one person. It is a kind of big survey of what it is to be human. And because it comes from so many different sources, it's much more likely that the reader will identify with at least one aspect of how that theme is presented. So the reader will be engaged or sympathetic, because of maybe just one version of that story that was told to me by someone that I met.
Yeah. And do you think, because this kind of comes back a little bit to the question that we were talking about with David Foster Wallace, how it's not really relatability that we're talking about when we say that people can get invested in these stories and things like that. There is an emotional response. What do you think is responsible for getting kind of, in Bret's case, privileged Los Angeles disaffected people who are kind of the elites of society in a lot of ways, but you can still have an emotional response, both humorous and sad, for these characters? What do you think is how does this, it's not relatability, what is this unknown factor that gets this aesthetic response?
That's the tough one. I'm gonna have to think about that one. I don't want to just answer off the top of my head. I don't want to bullshit it. You can edit this to shorten it, I hope.
Oh yeah, there's no problem.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
On one level, I think it's the fact that in his work, in The Informers especially, he just seems to be documenting things from moment to moment. He's not dictating the emotional meaning of anything, whether anything is good or bad, whether we should feel sad at this point or happy at this point. He is just moving us through a scene or through a series of scenes, and we follow along because we will always be compelled to follow the moving thing, the thing full of specifics. And so the story is so filled with specifics and people taking action that we follow along with that. We stay entranced by that. And the fact that he doesn't dictate how we should feel about these events allows us room to be with them. Because if he did dictate a way to feel and it wasn't how we felt, then there would be that disconnect and we would leave the story. But he simply presents the story without presenting the meaning of the story, and he allows us to create the meaning, or simply to be with the story until its end, and have our own reaction. I think that's a big part of it.
Oh yeah, I think that's, yeah.
I leave the station after the newscast at 5 ends, telling Jerry I'll be back for the 11 o'clock edition by 10:30, and Cliff can do the promos. And I get into my car and drive out of the parking lot of the station to find myself driving to the airport, to LAX. I park and walk over to the American Airlines terminal and go to a coffee shop, making sure I get a seat by the window. And I order coffee and watch planes take off, occasionally glancing at the copy of the LA Weekly I brought with me from the car. And then I do some of the cocaine Simon gave me this afternoon and get diarrhea. And then I roam the airport and hope someone will follow me. And I walk from one end of the terminal to the other, looking over my shoulder, expectantly. And I leave the American Airlines terminal and walk out to the parking lot and approach my car. The windows tinted black, 2 stubs leaning against the windshield where the wipers used to be. And I get the feeling that there's someone waiting, crouched in the back seat. And I move toward the car, peer in, and though it's hard to tell, I'm pretty sure there's no one in there. And I get in and drive out of the airport. And as I move past motels that line Century Boulevard leading to LAX, I'm tempted, briefly, to check into one of them, just to get the effect, to give off the illusion of being someplace else. And the Go-Go's are singing head over heels on the radio. And from LAX, I drive to West Hollywood and find myself at a Revival Theater on Beverly Boulevard that's playing an old Robert Altman movie. And I park the Jaguar in a tow-away zone, pay for a ticket, and walk into a small, empty theater, the entire room bathed in red light. And I sit alone up front, flip through the LA Weekly, and it's quiet in the theater except for an Eagles album that's playing somewhere, and someone lights a joint, and the sweet, strong smell of marijuana distracts me from the LA Weekly, which drops to the floor anyway after I see an advertisement for Danny's Okie Dog, a hot dog stand on the Santa Monica Boulevard. And the lights dim, and someone in the back yawns, and the eagles fade. A tattered black curtain rises. And after the movie ends, I walk back outside and get in the car. And when the car stalls in front of a gay bar in Santa Monica, I decide not to go to the station for the 11 o'clock newscast. And I keep turning the key, and when the engine starts up again, I drive away from the bar and past two young guys yelling at each other in a doorway.
That was Brandon Martin reading from Water from the Sun. We hope you guys have been following along. And Chuck Palahniuk, I'm very sorry for not editing out that pause that I promised that I would. But I just felt like the interview was better raw.
Yeah, and you had to come pick me up, so you ran out of time.
Yeah, that's also true. So we're here, and we have the author Bjorn Halldorsson, who's been on the live stream before. You've been on starting at Rules of Attraction, American Psycho, and now The Informers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you just reread The Informers.
No, this is my first time reading this one.
First time reading this
Oh,
one.
yeah.
And what do you think?
I enjoyed it. It was interesting just looking at it in the perspective of sort of that cycle from Rules of Attraction through American Psycho to this one. Just in like looking at sort of the themes that follow through from both of those previous works, and it's like there's something I always really enjoy about about Bret's use of repetition in his text.
Yeah.
Which I find interesting, and it goes beyond language. He has these repetitive phrases that come up, whether it's GQ or Wayfarers, but it comes up to the point where like the landscape becomes slightly homogeneous in this weird way, where all the characters almost look alike. And you were speaking earlier about how like you enjoyed the mystery or sort of figuring out the connections between the characters.
Right.
I did the same thing. I was sort of like that was
Yeah.
one thing that I was enjoying, and chasing down
I was flipping
various
back
references. But at the same time, like it almost felt like it didn't really matter, because they fit the same mode.
Yeah.
Which sort of puts feelings more in the sort of center line of it in this weird way. And I don't know, he has always seemed to me to be a writer who writes about obsessions in like a very particular way.
Mm-hmm.
And Rules of Attraction is certainly about obsessions.
Mm-hmm.
And American Psycho is perhaps about obsessions, but also having the ability to, gratify all of your obsessions.
Yeah.
And then this one, I found this one to be similar to Rules of Attraction in that there's a lot of wants. People are desperately wanting other people who don't want them, or in some cases just don't want anything. And I found it to be done like a lot more sort of subtly here in a weird way. And he still has those high points. I found it interesting that Coldon earlier talked about, he mentioned The Secrets of Summer and Discovering Japan, which are both kind of, those are the kind of the Patrick Bateman-iest stories.
Yeah.
But my particular favorites were actually, the other end of that spectrum, which is the stories that show like a slight humanity to them. In particular, In the Islands was one that I really, really enjoyed.
Yeah, In the Islands I found quite interesting. Like I think I said it with Coldon, where there's this thing about the father that if you watch the movie adaptation of The Informers, they made him the annoying father.
All right.
But there's something when I read it from his point of view where I don't know how Bret would, like how he kind of knew this feeling, because I'm just a stepfather at the moment, and I felt when I was reading this, I felt sorry for the dad the entire time, and I kind of knew this like weird competition and everything, everything he went through, I was like, what does his son expect? Like, how much do you need from someone? Which is a weird response, but I don't know if I would have had it a few years ago. But what I found the most interesting about these point of views between all of them, and in the islands or on the islands, is a great section for this, is that for some reason, I never knew if I was going to relate more to the narrator or to the people they were talking to. And so it always kind of like, I was always juggling between this because he seems to really hone in on certain things.
I mean, I just wanted to say first on the island, because you kind of put it in that perspective of like a father-son bond, but I don't know, I think the reason why I related so much to it is because it seemed to just be basically about men and sort of relationship between men and that sort of weird masculine thing where we're like, there's this desperate need to establish a pecking order in every situation.
Right.
And that seems to sort of spill over into this. And it's the father sort of looking at the son as not a child anymore. And there's this desperate longing in him. I mean, we start in this scene where he's kind of behind reflective glass at his work and sees his son like across the street. And he's desperate to try and like know what's going on in his son's mind and to, to gain basically his approval or his admiration, which is why he takes him on holiday, which is why he tries to, show off by like picking up women and all these things. But he also like, it goes utterly hand in hand with his need to humiliate him and sort of beat him at that game. And there's something just very, very male about that. Like I've had plenty of friendships that are sort of based around that, like that equation moving back and forth in my life, certainly.
Yeah, and there also is this, I don't know, like the desire for someone to be a child. Yeah, I don't have it in me that much. I've noticed, and so like I kind of understood. You want the person to be equal enough to compete with, because then you can relate to them, or you can have this relationship with them. Which I found that was interesting, that's what I got from it, where I think most people would say exactly what you were saying, but I thought like, I know this desire, like I don't want to be talking to a baby anymore. I want to be talking to someone that there can be a back and forth.
I am fascinated by your, your complete like attempts to relate to people in Bret Easton Ellis world. It's full of vampires and serial killers, and you're always looking at it going like, who am I in this scene? Like, interesting.
I find it. Well, I just find it interesting because, we want to go through. We're going to put the comments on in a second, but I want to go through all the stories. But what's the At the Zoo with Bruce? Yeah, I thought, because it's from her point of view.
That's the last one, right?
That's the last one. Yeah. I was like, I am that annoying guy. I was relating to who she's talking about in this way that I was like,
you're such a narcissist. You see yourself in every story you watch. Like.
No, but I was just like, because I was annoyed by him. But then I started to think, is this how I'm seen? If you're constantly these mild corrections, always trying to be like, oh yeah, it's not like this. There's something about, I don't know how he did it with every point of view. There's a point where I realize that he's captured something unique about each character, even though, like you said, there's this homogenous, I can tell they're all kind of in the same feeling, but they all have the perspectives from women throughout this whole thing is interesting because every woman I know has told me things that are interesting, like are similar to these sorts of things, or reactions like this. Like whether it's my sister or my wife or anyone, they've told me reactions that he seems to pick up, and he does a good job of.
I mean, I think what I said before about what I meant by sort of the homogeneous thing was basically that it kind of puts the feelings at the forefront. So you're not necessarily relating to the characters, to the persons, to their story, but you relate to that feelings. And in particular, that story, I'm just going to read like it because it has those final lines, the final lines of the collection. Yeah. And I find so much of the stuff in this and in other things about him, particularly Rules of Attraction, to be sort of the desperation of like love, of sort of like like dealing with love or like desire that you can't handle. You just kind of you just give up to it, even if it's not reciprocal, and that's when it turns into obsession. So like the final lines of the collection is. A lot of things might keep me away from Bruce. In fact, the odds look pretty good that something will. but I can't help it. I think to myself as we leave the zoo and get back into my red BMW and he starts it up, I have faith in this man.
Yeah.
So it's sort of that not being in control of like who you become like infatuated with.
And I didn't expect that ending.
Yeah.
That was the thing about when I got to that point, I was expecting her to be like, "Oh, Jesus, I'm so sick of men." And then this happens and I was like, there's something about it. And I don't know if narcissism is my problem completely, but there is, I think one of the effects of the writing is that there is something that always kind of like hooks you where you go like you said, the feeling is right there and you're present with it, so that it didn't matter if it was a woman or a man or what the person was who was doing it. There's something about it that always hooks you where you go, I know what they're talking about, or I know that feeling. Even if I'm not in that situation, not in that context, anything, there's a universality to every little, I think.
Well, I mean, he's absolutely kind of, he has this style where he immediately sets the scene. Like you just sort of, you basically feel like you're in a consciousness that just opens its eyes, and he kind of sets it in this like present tense, like I'm lying on this and I'm doing that. Like it's a very specific way to set the scene immediately. And you sort of find yourself there. So there is that, very much so.
So now what we're going to do, and you're going to do it because we're live here, and if the earthquakes take over, don't worry, we'll start the live stream up again.
It's not tremors, man. We're going to get light buzzings.
Yeah, I know. But it's fun to think there's going to be an eruption.
Yeah, I've been through a few. It's not that big a deal.
Yeah, we are on just a volcanic island. That's true. But how we're going to do? So if we can get the comments up on the screen. So where is Bret?
Yeah.
Not here. Not here. No, I don't think an author would like to be the host of his own book club.
Some authors, I'm sure.
Yeah. There are, but not. I don't think. But if anyone's commenting here, we have YouTube. Weight of text plays a big part of what I pick to read these days. That leaves Infinite Jest firmly out. So another David Foster Wallace.
Yeah, I was fascinated by what Chuck said about David Foster Wallace earlier, because I do relate to, I've always related a lot more to David Foster Wallace as a journalist and to his essays and sort of that organic process that he performs in his essays, where he starts off at a point and then moves to, he kind of recreates that sort of like getting like the experience of coming to a conclusion for you.
Right.
Fascinating way, but I've had similar things of like not relating heavily to his fictions, and I didn't know that Girl with Curious Hair was a satire of Bret Easton. That makes sense now.
An attempted one.
Yeah, it's not a great story. That doesn't make it better that it's a satire.
Yeah, but they're like because Bret Easton Ellis has said, I think it's end of the tour, the movie they did.
Oh yeah, I never saw that. That seems like a terrible idea.
Yeah, and there's this thing about, for some reason, with a guy who wrote all this different stuff and had his essays and everything, they tried to make him this kind of like pudgy, jolly saint, where the most interesting things about him is that this obsessiveness in his essays, that you're there, and they're very technical and cold, but interesting in all these ways, and I like the essays as well, but there's a thing about him that he, like, his obsession with his one girlfriend, where he like just basically stalked her and and then as soon as they were together, he would disappear. Like this sort of personality, that is interesting.
Yeah, when showed up at her birthday with like a brand new tattoo of her name and stuff.
Yeah, like that's the sort of thing where I'm like, okay, now there's something interesting to this. But when you try and, just because someone is incredibly clever, like Chuck said as well, he's a very clever writer and people kind of recognize that, to make him into this saint, it ruins kind of the tone of it, because, well, also maybe his fiction wasn't as effective as he would have wished.
I mean, his fiction is amazing, but like the only pieces of the writing that I really kind of got attached to or sort of like left its mark was probably brief interviews with hideous men, which is kind of delving into that like horrific, like it's basically like dipping into toxic masculinity and this very beautiful like shared moments between men where they're like telling these like horrific stories. Did you read that one? There's where he's confessing to his friend that, you know, he got married to his wife because she had a child before, so he could be absolutely certain that like having another one wouldn't ruin her body.
Yeah,
Just these
yeah.
awful-
Yeah, that's funny. I've heard men say that to this day.
Yeah.
can't name them.
That's the thing. That's what the thing I loved about those stories is that those conversations did not seem unlikely or strange to me. I have been witness to them myself and like taken part in them, but it was something very disarming about seeing them on the page.
That is something that is interesting. Even like, because about Bret, who this is all about at the end of the day, is that when you announce something that is what everyone knows already that people say or do, and then because you're the person to put it into fiction or be the famous person who says it, then you have to answer for it. Like you have these comparisons like the Marquis de Sade, things like that. That person was not the evil person of all of France. He was basically just telling what the French aristocrats were doing. And that a lot of this with Bret, when you see the behaviors and the thoughts and the anxieties of people in these places, he's showing what really is happening and then also taking the blame for it in this weird sort of way. And when transgressive fiction, because it's supposed to be crossing a boundary, I think the ironic thing about it is it's not crossing a boundary, it's saying what we already know to be true, but now we get to point a finger at someone.
Well, that sounds like a stand-up comedian. His point of view.
Yeah, but there is like if you read I don't think you can read Chuck Palahniuk or Bret Easton Ellis and without being like, oh, these are things that I know. But if you admit to it, then all of a sudden you're complacent in the badness, rather than saying you know what they're talking about. Because that's why with American Psycho, which I found so interesting, was that I related to it because I related to these feelings, some of these feelings, these extremities. But I also related to this kind of like when you hear and see all this stuff, it becomes something that's in you, even if you don't want it to be. It's a part of your like imaginative landscape.
Oh yeah. I see what you mean.
Yeah.
I mean, I related more to just the insecurities that he seemed to be passing through in each chapter.
So, okay, The Informers is a true masterpiece. Beautiful, brutal, haunting. I love the explanation of how short stories can be more perfect than novels.
Yeah, I found that fascinating.
That's actually when Nick Pizzolatto, the guy who wrote True Detective, he did a 2-part podcast with Bret, where Bret had him as a guest, and they were talking about Tom Cruise, and that was something that he said and Bret and him were talking about, is that the short story form can almost be, it's one of those things that can be perfect, whereas the novel is meant to be a little bit digressive and baggy and things like that. And
the short form is also, I think Gianna Diaz talked about that it's because it's smaller in many ways. It's this space where you can take more risk, because it's a lot easier to throw out a bad short story than it is to throw out a bad novel.
Yeah.
Like throwing out a bad novel takes guts, but like throwing out a bad short story, you can do that. You can get back on your feet, which I think leads to you taking more risks. And it's also it's just, short stories, they're just this very tight frame.
Yeah.
So they almost feel like one of those puzzles where you're moving the tiles around, because everything has to be in place in this weird way. There's no fat on a good short story.
That's
basically.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And that's probably one of the major things that I enjoyed stylistically about this, is just where he chooses to begin and end his stories, which are always sort of very en medias res.
Yeah.
Just the sheer brevity of it.
Yeah. I know. I feel the same way. I felt like, I think I said it before as well. I felt this great calm about reading this, because I knew they were all interconnected, but I could just read them and enjoy them. And there's something about just this intense dip into everything, and then to be able to back out. Whereas with American Psycho, I always took a plan. I don't want to be interrupted. I'm going to read this and I'm going to get this over with. Okay, we have hi from Tokyo. Hello in Tokyo. That's nice. Great show. Thanks. Earthquakes regular here too recently. Okay, nice.
Yeah.
That's good. Earthquakes.
Or
Well,
not great, I guess.
well, you know, we're on a cooling planet, and
Well,
we
they
all
have taller buildings than us, so.
That's true. The Informer is also one of Nick Cave's favorite. I first read Informers when it came out after American Psycho. Always wondered if Informers was actually written before, same time, or after.
That's interesting.
That is a great question,
Yeah.
because it does seem like this might be stuff that Bret had collected for a while.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, and then brought forward.
And I definitely wondered whether the sort of the story cycle thing, like at which point it turned into a story cycle, whether that was a later thought to sort of pull it together.
Yeah.
Whether it was scattered. But then he kind of does that through all his fictions, like even like there's reference to Sean and Lauren in this,
exactly.
who, you know, appeared in Rules of Attraction. So it's a very, like, I find in my writing, I constantly have to struggle because I'm not interested in people's names, basically. Yeah. So I've discovered that I've written like a novel and like there's 3 characters with the same name. So I do wonder, but his names, like the names he chooses to use, which are all very bland, like white people names.
Yeah.
And I mean, that goes hand in hand with like, you know, everyone, like there's not a single person in this book who isn't blonde. I think the only person is Anne, the girl who arrives in LA and is sending the letters back, and she turns up blonde by the end of it. So everyone is young, blonde, and tan, or at least blonde and tan in this.
Yeah.
I lost my train of thought there.
Oh, that's okay. We have more. Andrei Byakov says, I've read The Informer several times in Russian translation, but after listening to this stream, realized the meaning of some sections, for example, the last sentence, are a little different in the original, so I need at least to read it in English ASAP. That, you know, that is a thing. Iceland is famous for doing translations where it's nothing like the book they translate.
Really?
Yeah, Dracula famously is a completely different...
Oh, yeah, but that was that was back in the day.
You know, and so, but there is always that.
I mean, we had the same thing happen with us. Like, people didn't realize for a long, like Halldór Laxness, our Nobel laureate, like people for a long time, somehow all the translations that made it out of the country completely missed the sort of dark sense of humor that Icelanders have about things, and we're just these very depressing, like Upton Sinclair types of like depression, whereas we find them to be hilariously funny. Like I remember the start of the Fish Can't Sing, which I think the first line says something like, they say that there's nothing better for a child than losing its mother, except perhaps also losing its father. Which is a good joke, I think.
I think Eli Roth, like when he was making the Green Inferno, he would show the videos of like the people being like, you know, killed and everything, and the people that he was filming with, the indigenous people that he was filming with, they thought it was hilarious. Then of course people in America were like, oh, this is awful and exploitive. But the people there enjoy it. So it is kind of like...
It's a little more complicated than that, but yeah.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. It is more complicated. The stories written further, the styles developed in Less Than Zero, which I like very much, as it's some of his strongest LA stuff.
Yeah, I did wonder about that. Yeah, I like just because this is a very much an LA book, and it made me sort of look at it in terms of like what are some of the other like big LA books that you can think of?
Nathaniel West.
Yeah. Oh yeah, of course, The Locust.
Yeah, Locust. Day of the Locust. You have Raymond Chandler.
Yeah.
I just watched the Long Goodbye because Bret mentioned it on the podcast, and it's great. Robert Altman.
Oh yeah.
Robert Altman, who also did Shortcuts.
The Raymond Carver adaptation.
Yeah, which is also very like, that's kind of like a similar into kind of how this book is put together in lots of ways.
Yeah.
It has that sort of feel to it.
But it goes even further with the LA thing, like how everybody's constantly wearing T-shirts to say Los Angeles or California.
Yeah.
And it becomes this weird stasis, like hellscape almost that people can't escape. And it's also, I wondered about the 80s, like why it was set in the 80s, but then I guess like most of his stuff is set in the 80s.
Right.
But it did feel like they felt very, very trapped, like trapped in time and trapped in location and trapped in weather.
Yeah.
Like it felt, and I've heard people talk about that in LA, that like that's the one thing that kind of messes with your mind when you move there from other places, is just the complete absence of a season.
Yeah.
Just like every day it just looks the same.
Oh, I'm trying to, what's the comedian's name? Daniel Tosh.
Oh.
He has a joke that he does where he's like, yeah, people say you live in LA. I couldn't live there. I like seasons. He's like, yeah, we like seasons too. That's why we got rid of the shitty ones. It's a great joke.
Yeah, there's also the Bill Hicks line about like how, you know, he can afford scarves,
Yeah.
cappuccinos and rosy-cheeked women.
Yeah. But yeah, you're right about the LA thing with Bret. It was interesting because like one of the things that kind of prompted this whole book club is The Shards, which is this new audio novel. And again, he's going back to LA, back to like basically when he was in high school, and it's kind of like it's hinting as a memoir that kind of formed him as a writer and the events that took place that made him who he was. And you can see he is always going back to that. And there is something about this kind of like, I don't know, but isn't a lot of writers, their formative experiences are what they kind of go back to in many ways?
Yeah, I mean, childhood is a deep well, basically, until you get to, you know, middle age. That seems to be the other deep well that people start dipping into.
Yeah, yeah. But has that well might have disappeared with Viagra a little bit.
Yeah, well.
Will the movie be discussed too? I know it's a book discussion, but it might be interesting. Love from Hungary.
I would love to hear some thoughts on it, but I have to admit I haven't seen it. I didn't see the movie.
Well, luckily, if you're watching this right now, we're actually going to add a few things to this live stream once it comes out, because we do the live stream and then we edit it and we put it on YouTube so it has like posterity and you can check it out. And we're actually looking into doing an interview with John Foster, which is the actor in The Informers, and we would like to talk about the movie because the movie is an interesting attempt at taking something kind of so all over the place like The Informers, and then how could you bunch it into a 90-minute or 2-hour movie? It seems almost impossible because of this would be something where it would almost seem like what would be like not serialized, but like a TV show where they don't have every episode doesn't have to link to the other one. Yeah. So this would be more of a mini series than a movie, but they did do a movie, and so yeah, we'll if you guys subscribe to the Bret Easton Ellis YouTube channel, once we have the new interviews, we'll add that onto there as well. Bret Easton Ellis is a true icon of transgressive art, a master of brutal and beautiful prose, and a total legend. Joshua Palace, thank you.
I wonder about that. Because just that phrase, beautiful prose, because I feel like a lot of the things he plays with is actually like playing around with sort of ugly prose to some extent, like with the use of repetition and with sort of like some of the gorier scenes in American Psycho. Also, but in particular that constant theme of just like not avoiding the big sort of like decorative words and just using simple and repetitive language to some extent. Yeah, there is this Americanness to it where he does want it to be simple, and like the poetics to him are form and structure and style a lot more than they are necessarily like this kind of beautiful prose type thing. And it's never overwritten. And what I think, well, I guess, because I said it in American Psycho as well, but I'll say it again because you guys are watching. There is this interesting thing where he wants this to be aesthetics always. This is always supposed to be just an experience, but he's very much a writer of ideas. And they're like, these ideas are there, but he doesn't hit you on the head with them. Like I would say a lot of British writers might do. Like you have it like Martin Amis or things like that, where you want to be clever. You want your narrator to be clever so that the reader goes, okay, I'll follow along. Oh, yeah. And David Foster Wallace does that as well, where it's like, hey, the reason you're listening to me is because I'm getting my authority from how clever I am. But a lot of these characters are not, but there are big ideas here. There was always a kind of a big ideas. I mean, David Foster Wallace talked about that. One of his major demons was his sort of like fighting that desperate needs that he had to, get the reader to like him and show the reader how clever he was.
Right.
That was, I think that there's a great conversation, you can find it online, with Larry McCaffrey, where they talk about that, where he kind of admits to that like constant fighting of like just of trying to rein himself in a way, which I think we all have. I definitely have it in my writing. I always, it's sort of the final thing that you do before handing in the manuscript is take out the stuff that's just in there to show that you can write. Yeah, and that's, I think maybe because Bret has written his novel so early, at like 21, because like I know a lot of writers say you don't really become a writer until you're in your 30s.
and like doing it that young, but from being that young and then not doing that when he was 21, when Lesson Zero came out. In Lesson Zero, he doesn't try and show, look how smart I am.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen either, which I think myself, I would have like definitely done and did in everything I ever wrote at that age. And so this kind of restraint is interesting to see.
Yeah. I'm just glad to hear your theory about how you don't become a writer until you're 30, because I thought I'd wasted my 20s on, drinking bars.
No. You're never wasting your time drinking. Other people are just wasting your time. Yeah. I don't want anyone to start saying that. Okay. Hi, greetings from Argentina. Oh, hello. It's so great to see a discussion of my favorite book with another of my writing heroes, Chuck Palahniuk. Mind-blowing. One question. Has anyone seen the discarded footage with Brandon Routh as the vampire? Does it exist?
That's from the movie, I guess.
That's from the movie, yeah. The vampire section is completely taken out. And, there's they tie everything together a little bit different, and it doesn't have everything in there, but it has some of the major kind of plot points.
I was so fascinated by the vampire section.
Yeah.
It's just, if you look at it in terms of the time when it came out.
Yeah.
Like, because this is like Anne Rice is doing vampire novels. You have Interview with a Vampire. I guess you have The Lost Boys also, John Carpenter. Yeah. So like vampires are big. So it kind of made me think about going back to the story about like the girl who goes to LA and is writing all these letters back.
Yeah.
And she's constantly getting people to like read her her writing that she's doing for creative writing, and their comments is always that, it's not commercial. It's not commercial. Like, people keep saying that, and then finally towards the end, when she's bleached her hair and she's doing aerobics and, has started dating, a movie producer in his like 40s.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden, her writing is commercial. So it almost this is probably a stretch on my part, but it almost felt like this sort of joke of like throwing vampires in there because they were like almost commercial at the time.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think that's a stretch. I think there is this kind of like seeping into pop culture that's in all of his stuff, where he knows kind of what's going on and he knows what's selling, and that's how you get, like in this book, like American Psycho, where he says surface, surface, surface. In this book, they say image, image, image. Yeah. So there's these repetitions of these ideas going throughout the whole thing. But wasn't there another movie, I think it's called Marvin, where it was about a guy who you think is a vampire, and then it turns out that he might be just mentally ill.
I think that's older. I think that's 80s.
Yeah, I think it's 80s. Yeah, but that kind of has that feel too, where it's like you start out in the Story of Summer, where you go like, okay, he's a vampire, and there's just vampires, and they've been mentioned before in the book that there might be vampires. Oh, so now there's vampires.
Yeah.
But then all of a sudden, the therapist is like, yeah, are you going to do this again? And you start to realize, okay, this person might not be a vampire. They just might be going crazy.
Could be, but they are basically the only character in the entire novel who is, happy and knows what they want, it seems like.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Vampires.
Yeah. American Psycho, as a novel, is incredibly powerful because we are trapped with Patrick. The film can capture that and censored the novel. I think
interesting.
I think that we discussed that in the last live stream, which you can always check out. All of these are put up on the YouTube stream, but on the YouTube channel. But yeah, it's a different thing completely. It's written and angled differently, and of course, when you're not in the mind of someone and it has to be from this outward appearance, it all changes.
Yeah.
Racist vampires eating juice at the Ivory on Robertson Boulevard. The whole chapter is funny as hell.
It is funny. It's a big release, sort of after everything you passed through up to that point.
Because also when you have this flattening of all the emotions together, there is this dread that's there in you because you're like, anything could happen. So even like sitting still on the train, it's a very it's my.
That was the one you connected to.
Yeah, that was the one I found was my favorite story. But I also was always expecting, okay, when is this break going to happen? And then I stopped having that expectation, and then of course the last story where I'm like, I've given up on I'm not giving up, but I'm like, okay, maybe there's going to be, and then he breaks into saying he's an alien called Yonkor, and I was like, I do have faith in this man. He knows exactly the time to kind of bring it back so it all works. There was a vampire section in American Psycho. Was it?
I can't remember. I mean, there was everything in American Psycho, basically.
But I'm not sure if there's a. It might have been referenced, but
there was a lot. He was constantly drinking blood and stuff. So
but I mean, like saying there's vampires, like in LA there are these this references to predators coming into the city and
It does
disappearing.
get planted. Like there's people are constantly like it is interesting how the vampires turn up at sort of the end of this sort of periphery violence that we've been witnessing.
Yeah.
Like there's very little violence actually on the page in the
Right.
scene we witness. There's a lot of sort of like emotional stuff going on and there's like dismissiveness. But the actual violence is always very much on the periphery to
That's
the start.
right, yeah.
People are finding, there's rumors about, oh, he disappeared, but I
Yeah.
heard somebody found his arms in a shopping bag behind a dumpster
Right,
somewhere.
exactly. And they don't respond
Yeah.
to it. Yeah.
And this guy got picked up, and like there's also like his friend got picked up by a breakdancer who cut his throat.
Yeah.
Which is there's some I don't know why, but there's something hilarious about a breakdancer doing that.
Yeah.
I can't quite place that. So, but it's always on the periphery. So with like when the vampire story hits,
Yeah.
all of a sudden, sort of you
Yeah.
get the darkness right there.
Was that I can't believe I can't remember what story this is, but when the
I'll find it.
when the the father dies in a plane crash.
Oh yeah, when he goes up to like photograph
and
him.
he's like, he's like a little Darth Vader.
Yeah,
Because
and he's
it-
sort of flirting with like the rescue worker who's taking him up there, and,
Yeah,
and
to
he
look-
gets
yeah.
he gets him to take a picture of him with his like father's body.
Yeah.
That almost felt like, even that one I didn't connect with so much on the terms of the violence or the grotesqueness. It felt like a really, really desperate attempt by a desperate person to try and like get some feelings, get some feelings out of his father's passing.
Yeah.
And like even like getting the memento mori of it, just to have something.
But that is I think a lot of Bret's writing is the response to trauma.
Yeah.
And this anxiety poetry type thing, like American Psycho seems to be as well. I agree. There's like the violence, if you're reading it closely, is kind of periphery, even when it's the thing he's saying directly to you.
I mean, that's a great. I'm just thinking about this because it comes into my head all the time. There's a beautiful quote from Flannery O'Connor from one of her essays about writing, where she talks about, because she was very open about being a Christian and being a Catholic.
Yeah.
Which kind of like the first time you hear that, it blows your mind a little bit if you've read like A Good Man Is Hard to Find and all those like fairly gory stories.
Yeah.
And she had this great quote that she was talking about people who were always asking her why there was so much violence in her stories.
Yeah.
And she said that she'd always found that her characters were so hard-headed that violence was almost the only thing that got them out of their stupor and got them to prepare for their moment of grace.
Yeah.
And it sometimes feels a little bit like in Bret that like people are desperate to feel something quite a lot of the time, and I feel like a lot of that a lot of that longing and obsession that they place on other people, and usually people who are completely unavailable emotionally or locationally to them.
Yeah.
It holds hands in hand with that. It's this desperation to have a genuine feeling. Flannery O'Connor also said that, reading a story was a way to have a feeling, to feel something.
Wow. I think that's the best analysis so far on the live stream. Wow, that's great. Bret and Chuck are two of the greatest writers of all time, the most influential on my own writing. Total respect, much love to these legends.
Okay.
Supposedly the stories from The Informers were written in Bret's early years, and since Glamorama was taken longer to write, I think it took 8 years to write, the publishers wanted something more from him in the meantime. Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, and I think.
This is Michael Hardy. He's a member of the Bret Easton Ellis podcast Facebook group.
Oh.
Yeah, and so he makes
That makes a lot of sense to me in a lot of ways, just in terms of the story, and it's a nice like little breather after American Psycho also. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. But I enjoyed it in that sort of. But it has a lot in common with Rules of Attraction, so I'm not necessarily surprised.
Yeah. I think now we can have a few more comments, but other than that, on the subject of vampire, okay, this is a long one, so I will read it. This is Andrei Belikov, again, I believe you're in Russia. On the subject of vampires, to anyone who likes Section with Vampires and the Informers, I would recommend a great short story, The Lost Art of Twilight by Thomas Ligotti, which somewhat similarity combines realist first-person narration with surprisingly scary and animalistic depictions of vampires. Right. So Thomas Ligotti is also one of the inspirations for the True Detective
All right.
first season. that was very popular with Nick Pizzolatto, who was on the Bret Easton Ellis podcast. I'm just tying everything together.
I was always like, to me, it was always Richard Matheson, the old I Am Legend.
Yeah.
Sort of the pulpiness. That was always my favorite sort of vampire novel that I read.
Yeah, I like. Well, I really because I ended up reading Dracula, the Icelandic version and the original version. So I have this kind of like. I also like epistolary novels.
Yeah.
Because I like letters. I don't know. There's something I wish I got more letters.
Dracula is just, it's such a wonderful feat of, because it's not even epistolary. Like some of those things are supposedly, like it feels like you have like a box full of just random objects, and because there's like some of the parts of it are supposedly like recorded on monographs and like all these new technologies.
Yeah. It's okay. How did you react to On the Beach? It has always been particularly sad to me.
Oh yeah, that's the one where the girl is dying. And her like old like high school sweetheart is sort of like feels slightly stuck there.
Yeah.
And it definitely feels that it has that like feeling of being stuck with someone who's experiencing a long-term slow trauma and sort of the desperate desire to try and escape the situation, either by just leaving or escaping into various forms of, be it drugs, be it sex, be it anything else. So I very much.
And there's also a repulsion to weakness and death because it reminds you of your own possibility. I don't necessarily respond this way, but I know people who like the idea of these things they stay away from because they just don't process them. And so like seeing him kind of become numb to it, I think that's a normal response to like for some people, because death, as much as sex and violence is very taboo, death is still very taboo to almost everyone because it's a very difficult thing to understand and comprehend.
All that not dealing with it ends up somewhere. That does something to you.
That's true. Okay, On the Beach was the one they filmed. One of the film scenes they did well. Yeah, I thought the ending of The Informers, where he walks away on the beach, was so good that I tried to do a similar thing in the intro.
You walked into Nauthólsvík. How was the water that day? Do you know how?
I filmed the intro today or yesterday, because it's the morning now. But I filmed it yesterday because we couldn't get the camera crew or anything together. There was all these issues, and so I just took my tuxedo and walked into the.
Me and my wife
freezing.
Me and my wife go swimming there like every week, basically.
Oh, well,
it's getting good. It's up to like 4 degrees now. It was like -1 when we started doing it like this.
It was cold
this winter.
Yeah,
yes.
It was freezing, and
it's
I just
good for you, bracing.
And the funny thing though is that when you walk into the ocean with a tuxedo on, part of you goes like, "Why stop?" You're like, maybe I'll just keep going. Like I got the tuxedo on. This is a good exit. So this has been the Bret Easton Ellis Podcast Book Club live stream number 4, The Informers. A big thank you to Colton Martin again for all the animations, and Lucky Records, Dagger, Davith for here, and Victor for helping run the live stream. Bjorn, thank you for being a great guest. This is only made possible through help. And guys, if you want to follow along with the live streams we're doing, the next live stream is Glamorama. We're planning a big thing for it. We're going to be making a big video, but also any comments you have on Glamorama or things like that, if you follow me on Twitter or you go and comment into the event page on Bret Easton Ellis' Facebook page, we can get these questions up and get these discussions going. And if you think there's a guest or something you'd like to see, let us know. This is a community and we're trying to build something together. But other than that, I hope everyone had a wonderful time. I did.
Yeah,
this was really, really great. I enjoyed it.
It's 4 o'clock in the morning here.
It's 4 a.m. here. It's time to close it down. Thank you guys very much, and thank you again to Coldon and to Brandy Martin and to everybody who did this, and Baltazar Brecky, of course, for getting all the camera stuff and everything for a ridiculously inexpensive price. Thank you guys. Have a wonderful night.
Have a good one.
I'm over and out. I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just step back, just thinking about you, baby. When I'm passing by, I got my shoes untied, and I lost track of the wondering why. When I think about it, makes me think I'm right. Wonder about it and I don't know why. Won't you tell me, baby? I'm over and up, I got my shoes untied, and I'm thinking about you every single night. It's not enough for me to just stand by, just thinking about you, baby. I'm over and in, I got my shoes untied, and I hold the answer to your question why. Tell me you left me and I won't lie, just thinking about you, baby. Sophisticated from my head to toe. Tell me something that you just don't know. Oh, I get warmer as I